What if everything we think we know about history is missing a crucial piece of the puzzle? Picture this: a simple tool, something so ordinary it barely gets a second thought, suddenly vanishes from a community. Not a war, not a natural disaster, but the quiet disappearance of a single shared object. And yet, entire ways of life begin to crumble, traditions fade. Economies collapse, social bonds unravel. This isn't just speculation, it's a pattern that's repeated itself across cultures and centuries, hidden in plain sight. Today, we're uncovering 23 astonishing moments in history where the loss of one communal tool sent shockwaves through civilizations, rewriting their futures in ways no one could have predicted. Think about the objects we rely on every day: the humble hammer, the wooden plow, the communal oven. They're so woven into the fabric of our lives that we hardly notice them until they're gone. But history shows us just how fragile that fabric really is. Take the ancient Mesopotamians, for example. When a drought made their bronze sickles too brittle to harvest grain, it wasn't just a farming problem. It triggered food shortages, which led to riots, which toppled governments. One broken tool became the first domino in a chain reaction that reshaped an empire. Or consider the Inuit communities of the Arctic, whose entire survival depended on shared bone needles for sewing sealskin clothing. When those needles vanished due to overhunting, it wasn't just a craft lost, it was a lifeline severed, forcing entire villages to migrate or perish. These stories aren't just relics of the past, they're mirrors reflecting our own world back at us. In an age where we're more connected than ever, we're also more dependent on the tools and systems we often take for granted. What happens when a critical piece goes missing? What does it reveal about the invisible threads holding societies together? As we journey through these 23 cultural breakdowns, you'll start to see history, and maybe even our modern world, in a startling new way. Because sometimes it's not the grand battles or famous leaders that shape civilizations. Sometimes it's the quiet absence of something small, something ordinary, something no one thought to protect until it was too late. Communal tools are the silent architects of human civilization, so ordinary we forget their power until they're gone. These aren't just objects lying around a workshop or field, they're living extensions of a community's identity. Imagine a fishing net woven by an entire village, each knot tied with generations of knowledge, or a millstone turned by every family in a town, grinding not just grain but the rhythm of daily life into something shared. These tools bind people together in ways that go far beyond their practical use. They're physical manifestations of trust, cooperation, and collective memory. When a society loses them, it's not just losing a way to fix or build things, it's losing a piece of its soul. Take the blacksmith's anvil in medieval Europe, for instance. More than just a slab of metal, it was a communal hub where plows were repaired, weapons forged, and news exchanged. The ringing of the hammer was the heartbeat of the village. But when wars or famines forced smiths to abandon their anvils, the effects rippled outward. Broken tools went unfixed, harvests failed, and the social glue holding villages together weakened. Suddenly, neighbors who once relied on each other became strangers competing for dwindling resources. Or consider the Polynesian voyaging canoe, a masterpiece of shared engineering and navigation knowledge. These vessels weren't just transportation, they were floating libraries of star charts, wind patterns, and survival techniques passed down through chants and rituals. When colonial powers disrupted these traditions, the loss of canoe-building knowledge didn't just strand islanders physically, it severed a connection to their ancestors and the natural world. The ocean, once a highway of kinship, became a barrier. This is the hidden truth about communal tools. Their disappearance doesn't just create inconvenience, it rewires societies. Without them, rituals lose their meaning. Trade networks collapse because no one can produce what they once bartered. Even systems of governance falter, since many laws and customs evolved to manage shared resources like irrigation ditches or grazing land. The deeper we dig into history, the clearer it becomes civilizations aren't toppled just by armies or disasters, but by the quiet unraveling of these everyday bonds. And perhaps that's the most unsettling lesson of all, because in our modern world of disposable gadgets and isolated routines, have we unknowingly let our own communal tools slip away? High in the arid cliffs of the American Southwest, the Anasazi built a civilization that thrived against all odds until the day their most vital tools silently vanished. This wasn't a weapon or a monument, but something far more ordinary: the carefully maintained irrigation systems that turned desert into farmland. Carved into the rocky landscape, these channels and reservoirs were more than just engineering marvels. They were the beating heart of Anasazi society. Every planting season, generations of farmers gathered to clear debris, reinforce walls, and redistribute water according to ancient agreements. The system wasn't just about survival. It wove communities together through shared labor and mutual dependence. Then something went terribly wrong. Scholars still debate whether it was prolonged drought, internal conflict, or both, but when maintenance of those water tools stopped, the effects were catastrophic. Reservoirs silted up, canals cracked under the sun. Without this shared infrastructure, crops withered in fields that had bloomed for centuries. As food stores dwindled, the social contract shattered. Neighbors who'd once collaborated to divert mountain runoff now guarded their last trickles of water. The great cliff dwellings, once bustling with trade and ceremony, became monuments to a broken system. Within generations, entire villages stood empty, their inhabitants scattered across the desert in search of sustenance. What makes the Anasazi story so haunting isn't just the physical collapse, it's how quickly their culture unraveled when the tool maintaining it disappeared. Petroglyphs show how water symbols dominated their spiritual life, from rain dances to harvest rituals. When the irrigation systems failed, these traditions lost their meaning. Pottery designs that once celebrated flowing rivers grew sparse, replaced by cruder, hurried patterns. Even their architecture changed, with new settlements built not for community, but for defense. The loss of one shared tool didn't just create hardship, it erased a way of life. Modern archaeologists piecing together this collapse have found eerie parallels to today's challenges. Like the Anasazi, we rely on systems we barely notice until they falter: electrical grids, supply chains, digital networks. Their story forces us to ask, which of our communal tools, if lost, might send our own societies spiraling? Because history shows it's never just about the object itself. It's about the trust, the traditions, and the thousand invisible threads that snap when something everyone took for granted suddenly isn't there anymore. Imagine a world where the technology holding society together vanishes overnight. That's exactly what happened during the Bronze Age collapse, when the Mediterranean's most advanced civilizations crumbled like sandcastles against a rising tide. At the heart of this catastrophe wasn't just war or famine, but something far more unexpected: the sudden scarcity of bronze. This alloy of copper and tin wasn't merely a metal, it was the lifeblood of empires. From the swords that defended city walls to the chisels that carved grand monuments, bronze tools were the invisible foundation of everything, and when they disappeared, entire kingdoms unraveled. The crisis began with a fragile web of trade routes stretching thousands of miles. Tin, the rarer half of the bronze recipe, came from only a handful of mines scattered from Britain to Afghanistan. Merchants transported it across land and sea in a delicate dance of diplomacy and danger. Then, around 1200 BCE, something severed these connections. Scholars still debate whether it was pirate raids, climate shifts, or political unrest, but the result was clear. Without tin, smiths couldn't produce new bronze tools. Existing ones wore down or broke, and suddenly, farmers couldn't plow fields, soldiers couldn't repair armor, and artisans couldn't cast the sacred idols that held communities together. The domino effect was devastating. Mycenaean Greece, the Hittite Empire, and even mighty Egypt found themselves teetering. Armies that once relied on bronze weapons were overrun by invaders using newer, more abundant iron. Trade networks collapsed as ships stayed docked. No one could replace the bronze nails holding their hulls together. Even record-keeping faltered, as the style used to press cuneiform into clay tablets became scarce. Within decades, bustling cities became ghost towns, their grand palaces abandoned to the elements. But the most haunting lesson of the Bronze Age collapse isn't just about supply chains, it's about cultural memory. Bronze making wasn't just a technical skill, it was sacred knowledge passed down through generations in temple workshops. When those workshops fell silent, the secrets of alloy ratios and casting techniques vanished for centuries. The loss wasn't merely practical, it was spiritual. Societies that had measured their wealth in bronze suddenly found their god statues couldn't be replaced, their ritual objects irreparable. In a world where metal was magic, its absence broke something fundamental in the human psyche. Today, as we rely on semiconductors shipped across oceans or rare earth metals mined in distant lands, the Bronze Age collapse feels uncomfortably familiar. It's a stark reminder that no civilization is immune to the quiet unraveling that begins when a single, overlooked tool slips from our grasp. Because history shows us time and again, it's not always the loud, dramatic events that rewrite our future. Sometimes it's the silent absence of something we forgot we couldn't live without. The Maya civilization's towering stone monuments didn't just decorate their cities, they spoke. Every intricately carved stela, every temple wall etched with glyphs was a living library. These weren't mere decorations, they were the sacred texts, legal records, and historical archives of an entire people. The tools that created them, obsidian chisels, basalt hammers, and grinding stones polished by generations of artisans, were the unsung guardians of Mayan identity. So when those tools began disappearing during the 9th century, something far more devastating than an artistic decline unfolded, a cultural blackout. At its peak, Mayan stone carving was a communal ritual. Master craftsmen worked alongside apprentices, passing down not just techniques but the very language of their symbols. The tools themselves were often consecrated objects, stored in temple workshops where the act of carving blurred the line between labor and worship. But as political unrest strained resources and trade networks fractured, the high-quality obsidian needed for precision chisels became harder to find. Some scholars suggest deforestation made transporting heavy grinding stones impossible. Others point to warfare disrupting the guilds that guarded these skills. Whatever the cause, the effects were irreversible. Without their tools, the Maya couldn't carve new monuments to record victories, laws, or celestial events. The steady rhythm of history itself stuttered to a halt. The consequences rippled far beyond aesthetics. Imagine a society suddenly unable to update its legal code, commemorate its leaders, or worship its gods in the way they'd done for centuries. Ceremonies that once revolved around unveiling new carvings lost their purpose. Oral traditions, once reinforced by stone, began to fray. Even the elite class faltered. Their authority had been tied to the monuments that proclaimed their divine right to rule. As the blank stone slabs piled up in abandoned workshops, so too did the unrecorded days of a civilization slipping into silence. What makes this collapse so poignant is how much we've lost in the gaps. Modern archaeologists can translate Mayan glyphs, but thousands of stories remain unfinished carvings, left half-etched when the tools were set down for the last time. It's a stark reminder that cultural memory isn't stored in minds alone. It lives in the objects we use to externalize our collective wisdom, and when those objects vanish, even the greatest civilizations can fade into whispers. The Maya didn't just lose their ability to carve stone, they lost the mechanism that turned their present into legacy. And that's a warning that echoes across the centuries to our own era of fragile digital archives and disappearing crafts. How much of what we cherish today might one day be just as unrecoverable? In the frozen expanse of the Arctic, survival wasn't just about individual strength, it hinged on a blade most of us have never heard of, the snow knife. To the Inuit, this curved, razor-sharp tool was far more than a simple instrument. It was the architect of communal life. Crafted from bone, antler, or later metal, each knife bore the marks of its maker, passed down through generations alongside the sacred knowledge of igloo construction. The rhythmic scrape of these blades against compacted snow wasn't just noise, it was the sound of a society building itself, block by block, in the harshest environment on Earth. When European whalers and traders disrupted traditional supply routes in the 19th century, the consequences were immediate and dire. Metal for repairs became scarce, and imported substitutes often snapped in the brutal cold. Without reliable snow knives, the intricate dance of igloo construction faltered. Elders couldn't teach the young how to gauge snow density or carve the perfect spiral blocks that locked into a dome. Families that once built shelters in hours under howling winds now huddled in makeshift lean toss, exposed to lethal temperatures. The loss went beyond practicality, it shattered a cultural rite. Igloo building had been a communal event where stories were shared, marriages arranged, and disputes settled as hands moved in practiced unison. Now that glue dissolved. The ripple effects were catastrophic. Communities splintered as groups migrated in search of better conditions or metal scraps. Traditional hunting routes became impossible without the network of igloos that once dotted the ice. Even spiritual life suffered. The igloo's dome had mirrored the cosmos in Inuit cosmology, its construction a meditation on humanity's place in the universe. With no way to recreate these sacred spaces, ceremonies lost their power. What makes this collapse so revealing is how it defies modern assumptions about technology. We often think of innovation as linear, new tools replacing old ones, but in the Arctic, the snow knife wasn't just technology, it was a living extension of ancestral wisdom. When it vanished, no factory-made alternative could fill the void because the knowledge it carried was irreplaceable. Today, as climate change reshapes the Arctic faster than ever, the lesson echoes louder. Sometimes progress isn't about what we gain, but what we blindly let slip away, one unassuming blade at a time. The vibrant tapestry of the Silk Road wasn't just woven from silk threads, it was held together by the humble loom. Across deserts and mountain passes, from China to the Mediterranean, shared weaving tools were the unsung heroes of this ancient superhighway. These weren't just personal possessions, they were communal treasures, carefully maintained in workshops where techniques passed from master to apprentice over centuries. The rhythmic clack of wooden shuttles and the scrape of spinning walls formed a universal language, connecting cultures through the alchemy of thread and dye. But when political upheavals disrupted trade routes in the 6th century, something unexpected happened. The tools vanished first, and with them, the economic heartbeat of entire regions stuttered to a halt. Take the oasis cities of Central Asia, where Sogdian merchants had built fortunes on exquisite woven brocades. Their looms, complex wooden frames requiring specific hardwoods from distant forests, depended on a steady flow of materials along the Silk Road. As wars fractured the region, replacement parts became impossible to source. Broken treadles went unfixed, worn-out shuttles couldn't be replaced, and slowly the looms fell silent. The consequences rippled outward like a snagged thread unraveling a masterpiece. Without textiles to trade, merchants lost their primary commodity. Caravanserais that once buzzed with haggling traders stood empty. Even diplomatic relations frayed, as silk had long served as currency in political alliances and tribute payments. But the true tragedy lay in the cultural erosion. Weaving tools weren't just economic instruments, they were vessels of identity. The Inca women of Turpan, for example, used unique spinning discs to create yarns imbued with symbolic patterns. Each twist of the spindle encoded stories of migration and belief. When these discs disappeared, so too did generations of narrative artistry. In Persia, the loss of shared dyeing vats, massive ceramic pots maintained by entire neighborhoods, meant the extinction of color formulas guarded for centuries. The famed crimson of Samarkand, once bright enough to rival rubies, faded into memory. What makes this collapse so revealing is how it mirrors modern globalization's fragility. The Silk Road's weavers didn't just lose tools, they lost the infrastructure of interdependence that made specialization possible. A single broken loom in Dunhuang could mean a monastery in Tibet went without ceremonial banners, or a Roman noblewoman's wardrobe lacked its signature shimmer. It's a stark reminder that civilizations aren't just connected by what they trade, but by the shared tools that make trade possible. And perhaps that's the most enduring lesson of all. Because today, as supply chains stretch across continents, we're forced to ask which of our unseen, everyday systems might hold the threads of our own world together. And what happens if or when they too slip from our grasp? For centuries, the vast Pacific Ocean wasn't a barrier to Polynesians, it was a highway, their secret. The Voyaging canoe, a technological marvel carved from giant logs and lashed together with cords stronger than steel. But these vessels weren't just transportation, they were floating classrooms, workshops, and temples rolled into one. Every adze used to shape the hull, every bone needle that stitched the sails, every cordage tool that twisted coconut fiber into rigging, these were communal treasures, passed down through generations alongside the sacred knowledge of how to use them. When these tools began disappearing in the wake of European contact, something far greater than boat building was lost. The very thread that connected islands separated by thousands of miles of open water. The crisis started subtly. Missionaries and colonizers, baffled by Polynesian navigation, dismissed it as primitive. Traditional tools were replaced with metal axes that hacked rather than shaped, severing the intimate connection between craftsman and material. Worse, the communal spaces where canoe-building knowledge was shared, the beachside workshops where elders taught youths to read ocean swells by feel and stars by name, were abandoned for churches and trading posts. Without these gatherings, the precise techniques for shaping hulls to ride specific currents or weaving sails to catch seasonal winds faded from memory. A single missing adze might mean no one could properly carve the critical curvature of a mast, grounding entire fleets. The social consequences were profound. Islands that had traded volcanic glass for generations suddenly found their canoes rotting on shorelines. Marriage networks collapsed as families could no longer send daughters to allied islands. The great ceremonial voyages that renewed political alliances and redistributed resources became dangerous gambles rather than routine journeys. Even spiritual life suffered. the ocean had been a living entity to navigate, not conquer. When the tools to journey across it vanished, so did the rituals that gave meaning to the waves. What makes this collapse so haunting is how quickly isolation rewired cultures. On Rapa Nui, where deforestation had already made canoe-building impossible by the 18th century, islanders developed entirely new traditions to compensate. Birdman cults replaced ocean voyages as pathways to status. In Hawaii, the loss of long-distance canoes meant the end of tribute flows between islands, centralizing power in ways that reshaped governance. The tools hadn't just enabled travel, they'd maintained a delicate balance of connection and independence across thousands of miles. Modern efforts to revive Polynesian wayfinding, like the Hokulea voyages, reveal just how much was nearly lost. Today's navigators painstakingly reconstruct techniques from fragments of chants and half-remembered stories. It's a powerful reminder that exploration isn't just about courage or curiosity, it's about the shared tools that make the unimaginable possible. And when those tools disappear, horizons that once felt limitless can shrink to the shoreline, leaving generations stranded in a world suddenly made smaller. In the muddy fields of medieval Europe, the heavy wooden plow wasn't just a tool, it was the beating heart of every village. Unlike modern farm equipment, this wasn't something a single family could own or operate. Crafted from massive oak beams and reinforced with iron fittings, the communal plow required teams of oxen and the coordinated labor of an entire community to drag it through dense, clay-heavy soil. Villagers took turns guiding the blade, repairing the harness, and tending the animals, their survival literally hitched to this shared technology. But when wars or plagues swept through the countryside, and these plows were abandoned or destroyed, the consequences were catastrophic. Because without this one tool, the delicate balance of medieval life didn't just wobble, it shattered. Consider the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. As crop failures spread across England and France, desperate villagers often sold their plow animals for food or watched them starve. Without oxen to pull them, the plows stood useless in barns. Fields that had fed generations lay fallow, their unbroken earth refusing to accept seeds. But the crisis went deeper than empty stomachs. The feudal system itself relied on those neatly plowed strips of land. Peasants worked the lord's fields in exchange for the right to farm their own plots. No plow meant no harvest, which meant no tithes or taxes. Lords, suddenly without income, couldn't maintain knights or castle garrisons. The entire pyramid of obligations and protections began collapsing from the ground up. What's chilling is how quickly social bonds unraveled when the plow disappeared. Villages that had cooperated for centuries turned inward, hoarding what little grain they had. Traditional planting festivals, once celebrations of shared labor, became grim reminders of collective failure. Even the church's influence waned. Its calendar of saints' days had been tied to planting and harvest cycles, now thrown into chaos. The plow's absence didn't just create hunger, it erased the rhythms that organized medieval life. Archaeologists studying abandoned villages from this period find haunting clues to the plow's cultural power. In some places, farmers tried adapting by carving lightweight plows from whatever would remain, but these often broke after a single season. Elsewhere, fields show signs of being scratched with hand tools, a futile attempt to replicate what the communal plow had once achieved effortlessly. The deeper lesson here isn't about agricultural technology, it's about interdependence. The medieval plow required cooperation to function, and in return, it reinforced that cooperation every planting season. Its disappearance didn't just remove a tool, it severed the daily acts of trust that held communities together. Today, as we rely on invisible digital networks and global supply chains, the story of the medieval plow feels uncomfortably familiar. It's a reminder that civilizations aren't undone by the loss of flashy, celebrated technologies, but by the quiet vanishing of ordinary objects that silently weave people together. Because sometimes the most vital tools aren't the ones that dazzle us, they're the ones so essential we forget they're there, until suddenly, terrifyingly, they're not. The Ming Dynasty once boasted the most sophisticated bureaucracy on Earth. Its vast empire held together not just by armies but by paper, reams of it stamped with intricate woodblock printing. These weren't just documents, they were the nervous system of a civilization. Provincial exams, tax records, imperial edicts, all flowed through workshops where carvers, inkers, and printers worked in synchronized harmony. The tools they used, from the carefully seasoned pearwood blocks to the horsehair brushes that smoothed rice paper, were more than office supplies. They were the gears of governance, turning ideas into action across millions of square miles. But when these printing networks began fraying in the 15th century, the effects reached far beyond dusty archives. The world's most advanced administrative state started stumbling under the weight of its own complexity. At the heart of the crisis was a paradox. The very success of Ming bureaucracy had made it vulnerable. To manage their sprawling realm, officials relied on standardized manuals, farmland registries updated annually, legal codes revised every decade, examination texts memorized by scholars nationwide. This system worked because hundreds of local printing collectives could rapidly reproduce documents using shared techniques. A magistrate in Guangzhou could issue a decree knowing it would look identical to one in Beijing, thanks to communal toolkits and training. But as silver shortages and peasant uprisings drained imperial coffers, funding for these workshops dried up, replacement blocks couldn't be carved, ink recipes were lost, and scribes increasingly resorted to error-prone hand copies. The consequences were insidious. A tax record miscopied in one province might take years to correct, creating loopholes for corruption. Examination questions, no longer uniformly printed, began favoring candidates with access to privileged tutors. The system designed to ensure fairness was cracking along the seams of its own infrastructure. Yet the most profound loss was cultural. China's golden age of innovation, from clockwork mechanisms to agricultural treatises, had thrived on the rapid dissemination of ideas through printed manuals. When the chemist Song Yingxing compiled his groundbreaking Changgong Kaiwu in 1637, detailing everything from papermaking to metallurgy, he assumed these techniques would spread as previous works had. But with printing collectives in decline, his encyclopedia reached barely a fraction of the audience it deserved. Workshops that once buzzed with debates over improved plow designs or ceramic glazes grew quiet, their technical knowledge trapped in isolated pockets. The stagnation wasn't from lack of genius, but from the broken tools that once carried genius between minds. What makes the Ming story so revealing is how it mirrors modern knowledge economies. Like those Ming officials, we assume information will flow effortlessly until the systems enabling that flow falter. The dynasty's collapse warns us that innovation isn't just about having ideas, it's about maintaining the shared mechanisms that let ideas collide and grow. Because history shows repeatedly, when the tools of collective memory fade, even the brightest civilizations can find themselves groping in the dark, wondering where the light went. Deep in the rainforests of West Africa, the glow of a smelting furnace was more than just fire. It was alchemy, community, and prayer made visible. For over 2,000 years, African iron smelting wasn't merely a technical process. It was a sacred symphony conducted with tools that belonged to no single person, but to the entire village. The bellows carved from sacred trees, the clay tires that channeled breath into flame, the ritual hammers that shaped molten metal, these objects were never just functional. They were the physical embodiment of knowledge passed down through generations. guarded not by locks, but by initiation rites and oral traditions. When these tools and techniques began disappearing under colonial pressure and environmental shifts, the loss wasn't just industrial. It was the unraveling of an entire worldview. Take the case of the manned blacksmiths of Mali, whose furnaces once lit the night like constellations across the savannah. Their smelting process was a days-long ceremony where every tool had spiritual significance. The bellows weren't merely air pumps. Their rhythmic creaking was said to mimic the speech of ancestral spirits. The slag tapped from furnaces wasn't waste, but protective amulets buried at village boundaries. When French colonial administrators banned these practices in the early 20th century, dismissing them as primitive superstition, the consequences were immediate and devastating. Without the communal smelting events, villages lost their primary source of plowshares, hunting weapons, and even currency. Iron bars had been trade staples for centuries. But the deeper wound was cultural. Elders who once recited the epic of Sundiata while tending furnaces found their stories fragmenting without the ritual context that gave them meaning. The sacred groves where smelting tools were stored fell into disrepair, and with them, the ecological knowledge embedded in their placement, which trees to harvest without harming the forest, which clay pits yielded the best refractory material. Further east, the Haya people of Tanzania faced a quieter but equally profound collapse. Their furnaces, capable of producing steel at temperatures rivaling modern industry, relied on specially designed tires that created precise airflow. These clay nozzles were crafted by women using clay mixed with crushed termite mound, a recipe that encoded centuries of materials science. When German colonists redirected labor to cash crops in the late 19th century, the delicate chain of knowledge snapped. Younger generations, forced into plantation work, never learned the subtle art of termite clay selection or the songs that timed the smelting process. Within decades, furnaces that had operated since the time of Christ stood cold, their secrets locked in the memories of elders who passed away without apprentices. The tragedy of Africa's lost iron traditions isn't just about forgotten tools, it's about what happens when the boundary between technology and spirituality is severed. In Benin, the god Gu ruled over both warfare and metallurgy. Smiths were his priests, their anvils his altars. When colonial factories replaced hand-forged iron, the rituals maintaining social order lost their foundation. Disputes once settled at the forge with symbolic blade quenching now festered into lasting conflicts. Even agriculture suffered. Traditional hoes, perfectly weighted for local soils, gave way to mass-produced imports that accelerated erosion. Modern archaeologists working to reconstruct these technologies face a haunting realization: some gaps may never be filled. The iron blooms pulled from abandoned furnaces still bear the fingerprints of their makers, but the chants that accompanied their creation are gone forever. It's a stark reminder that tools are never just objects, they're the keepers of rhythm, relationship, and meaning. And when they vanish, they take whole universes with them, leaving behind not just silence, but questions about what we've sacrificed in the name of progress. On the vast grasslands of the Great Plains, the buffalo wasn't just food, it was the foundation of entire civilizations. For tribes like the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Comanche, the hunt wasn't a solitary act but a communal symphony, orchestrated with tools so specialized they blurred the line between practicality and sacred art. The bows laminated with sinew and horn, the obsidian-tipped lances balanced for precision throws, the fleshing knives made from rib bones. These weren't personal possessions but shared instruments of survival, maintained and blessed by the entire community. When the buffalo herds vanished in the late 19th century, it wasn't just a food source that disappeared. The intricate ecosystem of knowledge, ritual, and social structure built around those hunting tools collapsed like a gutted tipi in a prairie storm. Consider the buffalo jump, one of humanity's most ingenious hunting techniques. For generations, tribes like the Blackfoot coordinated these massive operations with near military precision. Scouts used specially crafted signal mirrors to communicate herd movements. Runners carried rattles designed to mimic wolf calls, steering panicked bison toward cliffs. At the base, teams waited with precisely weighted butchering tools to process thousands of pounds of meat before spoilage set in. Every tool in this chain, from the mirror's copper backing to the bone scrapers for hide preparation, was a masterpiece of adapted engineering. But when the US government sanctioned mass buffalo slaughter to starve native resistance, these tools lost their purpose almost overnight. By 1880, the great herds had been reduced from 30 million to barely a few hundred. Suddenly, the mirrors gathered dust, the rattles fell silent, and the butchering knives that once fed entire villages rusted in disuse. The cultural aftershocks were devastating. Buffalo hunting wasn't just about subsistence, it was the scaffold supporting plains societies. The communal hunt dictated seasonal movements, reinforced gender roles, women processed hides while men hunted, and even shaped spiritual practices. The sun dance, perhaps the most sacred ceremony, required buffalo skulls as altars. Without them, rituals lost their power. Social hierarchies based on hunting prowess crumbled, leaving warriors without status. Even the famed winter counts, pictographic histories painted on buffalo hides, could no longer be maintained, severing generations from their own stories. What makes this collapse uniquely tragic is how quickly knowledge atrophied. A Cheyenne bowwires technique for laminating horn might take 20 years to master, passed down through whispered lessons during hunts. With no buffalo to hunt, no hides to tan, and no sinew to string bows, these skills evaporated within a single generation. By 1900, many young plains people had never held a properly balanced buffalo lance or heard the creak of a hide-stretching frame. The tools hadn't just enabled survival, they'd been the physical manifestation of a relationship between humans, animals, and land. Their disappearance didn't just create poverty, it severed a covenant older than memory itself. Today, as native communities work to revive buffalo-centered traditions, they face a paradox. Some tools can be recreated, but the living context that gave them meaning is harder to restore. A modern-made buffalo lance may look authentic, but without the communal hunts that once tested its balance and the songs that blessed its edge, it's a shadow of what it once represented. This loss echoes far beyond the plains. It's a warning about what happens when we mistake tools for mere objects, rather than recognizing them as the keepers of entire worlds. Because sometimes extinction isn't just about species vanishing. It's about the quiet disappearance of the hands that knew how to speak to them, and the tools that made that conversation possible. Rome's aqueducts weren't just marvels of engineering, they were living systems, pulsing with water that sustained over 1 million people at the empire's height. But what truly kept this lifeline flowing wasn't the grand stone arches we admire today. It was something far more humble, the communal repair kits stashed in neighborhood workshops. Leather buckets for sealing cracks, bronze calipers for measuring pipe joints, specially mixed mortar recipes passed down through guilds. These unassuming tools were the silent guardians of Rome's water. When they began disappearing during the 3rd century crisis, the consequences rippled far beyond thirsty citizens. An entire urban way of life started crumbling from the pipes up. The system's fragility lay in its interdependence. Aqueducts required constant maintenance not by solitary workers, but by teams equipped with standardized tools. Lead pipes needed precise soldering irons heated to exact temperatures. Settling tanks demanded carefully weighted scrapers to remove mineral buildup without damaging plaster linings. These weren't skills one could improvise. They required generations of shared knowledge embedded in the tools themselves. A lead worker's mallet, for example, wasn't just a hammer. Its weight and balance were calibrated for the unique demands of water channel repairs. But as political chaos drained imperial coffers, funding for these neighborhood maintenance cooperatives dried up. Replacement tools became impossible to source, and soon cracks went unrepaired, joints leaked, and the lifeblood of Rome began seeping into the ground. The social impact was immediate and devastating. Public baths, the heart of Roman community life, were among the first casualties. Without reliable water flow, these sprawling complexes where citizens once debated politics and closed business deals became stagnant husks. The loss went beyond hygiene. It severed a critical space where social classes mixed and civic identity formed. Even law enforcement faltered. The Vigiles, Rome's firefighting force, relied on aqueduct-fed cisterns to combat blazes. As pressure dropped in the pipes, entire districts became vulnerable to catastrophic fires. But the most insidious damage was to Rome's very conception of urban living. The city's density, its towering insulae apartments and crowded forums, had only been possible thanks to abundant clean water. As aqueducts failed, the wealthy fled to self-sufficient country villas with private wells, while the poor were left to drink from contaminated Tiber River shallows. The communal ethos that once defined Roman life gave way to every man for himself survivalism. By the 5th century, the population had plummeted to barely 50,000, a staggering collapse fueled not by barbarian hordes, but by the slow-motion unraveling of maintenance networks. Archaeologists studying abandoned aqueduct tunnels find poignant evidence of this decline. In some sections, makeshift repairs show where desperate workers used broken roof tiles as patching material when proper mortar wasn't available. Other passages bear tool marks from improvised implements, the telltale gouges of repurposed farming equipment pressed into emergency service. These crude fixes held for a season or two before failing, each stopgap measure bringing Rome closer to the point of no return. What makes this collapse so chillingly modern is how it mirrors our own infrastructure crises. Like the Romans, we've built dazzling systems, electrical grids, subways, fiber optic networks that rely on invisible armies of technicians armed with specialized tools. The lesson whispered from those crumbling aqueducts isn't about stone or water, but about the fragile human networks that sustain our greatest achievements. Because history shows time and again, civilizations don't fail when their monuments are toppled, but when the ordinary tools that maintain them quietly vanish from communal workshops, one neglected repair at a time. In feudal Japan, the rhythmic splash of water wheels and the scrape of wooden plows through flooded paddies weren't just sounds of labor, they were the heartbeat of an entire social order. Rice cultivation wasn't merely agriculture, it was the fragile ecosystem sustaining samurai, peasants, and even the emperor himself. The tools that made it possible: communal threshing sledges, irrigation scoops passed down through village cooperatives, the massive wooden harrows pulled by entire families, were more than farm implements. They were the physical contracts binding Japan's rigid class system together. When these tools vanished during the chaotic Sengoku period of the 16th century, the collapse wasn't just agricultural. It was societal bedrock turning to quicksand. Consider the humble tagane, a sickle forged from repurposed sword steel. These blades weren't sold in markets, they were village property, meticulously maintained by blacksmiths who also served as spiritual intermediaries. Each harvest season, the tagane would circulate among families according to carefully balanced schedules, their use timed to the minute to maximize efficiency. But when warlords like Oda Nobunaga began confiscating metal for weapons, these sickles were melted down by the thousands. Suddenly, peasants couldn't harvest at peak ripeness. Rice that should have been bundled at dawn now molded in fields until noon, losing precious grains with every delayed swing. The domino effect was catastrophic. Drunken harvests meant smaller tax payments to samurai overlords, who in turn couldn't maintain their armies. By 1580, entire provinces teetered on the brink of rebellion, not because of battlefield defeats, but because missing sickles had disrupted the precise choreography of rice cycles. The breakdown went deeper than empty stomachs. Japan's entire social hierarchy revolved around rice. Samurai were paid in koku measures of rice yield. Temple donations funded by surplus harvests maintained spiritual order. Even the emperor's legitimacy stemmed from rituals involving sacred paddies. Without the shared tools that made intensive cultivation possible, this intricate web of obligations unraveled. Villages that once cooperated to maintain irrigation ditches turned on each other, sabotaging water flow to save their own fields. The famed Mura Hachabu village ostracism punishments lost their power when communities no longer needed collective labor to operate rice hullers or repair dikes. Archaeologists studying abandoned farmsteads from this period find haunting evidence of improvisation. In some regions, peasants resorted to using broken pottery shards as makeshift sickles, their clumsy cuts visible on surviving straw samples. Elsewhere, irrigation channels show signs of desperate repairs, rocks stacked haphazardly where wooden sluice gates once stood. The most poignant finds are the kokshi dolls carved from leftover tool handles, as if mourning the instruments they'd once been part of. What makes Japan's rice tool collapse so revealing is how it exposes the illusion of rigid social structures. The samurai sword may have symbolized power, but it was the peasant's sickle that truly upheld the system. When those everyday tools disappeared, the difference between lord and vassal, between order and chaos, proved far thinner than anyone imagined. It's a lesson that echoes uncomfortably today, in a world where we rarely consider how much our own stability depends on uncelebrated objects until the day they're not there to do their quiet, essential work. The Vikings didn't conquer the North Atlantic through brute strength alone. They did it with axes, not battle axes, but the humble woodworking tools that transformed towering oaks into sleek longships. These weren't just personal possessions, they were communal treasures stored in shared boatyards where every chip of wood carried generations of knowledge. The broadaxes for shaping hull planks, the spoon augers for drilling precise rivet holes, even the pine tar brushes made from horse hair. Each tool was a masterpiece of adaptation, perfected over centuries of trial and error in freezing shipyards. But when these tools began disappearing in the 11th century, the Vikings didn't just lose their ships, they lost the very mechanism that had turned frozen Scandinavia into a global superpower. The collapse started with something deceptively simple: iron shortages. Viking shipwrights relied on specialized metals, high-carbon steel for axes that held an edge through endless oak planks, wrought iron for clenched nails that flexed with the waves. As overmining depleted Scandinavian bog iron and trade routes shifted, replacements grew scarce. A single missing tool could halt construction for months. Without the right auger, workers couldn't drill the overlapping holes for lapstrake planking. A dulled broadaxe meant improperly curved hull sections that leaked under pressure. Slowly, the legendary shipyards that had produced vessels capable of crossing the North Atlantic fell silent, their half-finished skeletons rotting under tarpaulins. The consequences rippled far beyond boat building. Viking society revolved around the rhythm of ship construction. Winter months were for felling timber with ceremonial axes blessed by Thor. Spring brought communal caulking bees where families mixed pine tar while sharing news and arranging marriages. Even their legal system was maritime. The very word law comes from the Old Norse lag, meaning something laid down like ship timbers. Without these shared projects, social cohesion unraveled. Young men who once trained as carpenters turned to banditry. Trade networks collapsed as fewer ships made the annual run to Constantinople. Most devastating was the loss of exploration itself. Viking ships weren't just transport, they were floating laboratories of adaptation. Each voyage refined their tools, slightly narrower axes for Icelandic birch, deeper drafted keels for Mediterranean waves. When Greenland's colony starved in the 15th century, it wasn't just due to climate change. The settlers no longer had the tools to build the fishing vessels that might have saved them. Excavations at abandoned Greenland sites reveal heartbreaking improvisations, whalebone replacing wooden ribs, sealskin lashed over cracked hulls. The descendants of Leif Erikson had literally forgotten how to leave. What makes this collapse so poignant is how it redefines exploration. We think of Vikings as fearless adventurers, but their true genius lay in the communal workshops where knowledge was physically embedded in tools. A master shipwright's adze wasn't just sharp, its weight distribution encoded centuries of wave dynamics. When those tools vanished, so did the capacity to push boundaries, not from lack of courage, but from the silent erosion of shared craftsmanship. It's a lesson that echoes in our own age of fragile supply chains and disappearing trades, because exploration isn't just about setting sail, it's about having the right tools and the collective wisdom to use them when the horizon calls. Tenochtitlan wasn't just a city, it was a floating masterpiece, an Aztec Venice built on ingeniously engineered islands called chinampas. These weren't ordinary farms, but woven baskets of soil anchored to lake beds with willow roots, producing harvests so abundant they fed 250,000 people. The secret to their success, a toolkit so specialized it turned swampland into the most productive agricultural system in the ancient Americas. The curved digging sticks for dredging nutrient-rich muck, the woven reed screens that stabilized soil, even the ceremonial hose blessed by the rain god Tlaloc. These were the unsung heroes of Mesoamerica's greatest metropolis. When Spanish conquistadors dismantled these tools in the 1500s, they didn't just destroy farms, they unraveled an entire urban ecosystem. The precision of chinampa tools was staggering. Farmers used angled wooden scoops called huickli to dredge canals exactly 6 feet wide, the perfect width for maximizing water flow while minimizing evaporation. Each tool's curvature wasn't arbitrary, it matched the ergonomics of working from narrow canoes. Even the humble digging stick, or koa, was a marvel of adaptation. Its fire-hardened tip could break up clay without disturbing the delicate root systems below, while its length doubled as a measuring rod for planting intervals. These weren't just implements, they were physical extensions of centuries-old hydrological knowledge. Without them, the chinampas weren't just inefficient, they were impossible to maintain. When Cortez's forces demolished Tenochtitlan's infrastructure, the loss of these tools triggered a domino effect. Canals silted up without regular dredging, turning vibrant waterways into stagnant mosquito havens. The reed screens that prevented soil erosion rotted away, causing entire chinampas to disintegrate back into the lake. But the most devastating impact was on urban planning. Tenochtitlan had been designed around its aquatic farms, neighborhoods clustered near the chinampas that supplied them, with canals serving as both transport routes and natural sewers. Without the tools to sustain this balance, the city's brilliant layout became a death trap. Floodwaters that once drained efficiently now stagnated, breeding disease. Food shortages turned orderly marketplaces into riot zones. Archaeologists studying post-conquest Mexico City have found haunting evidence of this breakdown. Sediment cores reveal how chinampa canals filled with debris within decades, their careful geometry lost. colonial accounts describe starving Aztecs trying to farm with unmodified Spanish hoes, tools designed for European soils that tore apart the delicate chinampa root mats. The tragedy wasn't just the loss of crops, but the erasure of an entire philosophy of urban living. The Aztecs hadn't just built a city on water, they'd engineered a symbiotic relationship between land and lake, where waste nourished crops and harvest sustained temples. Their tools weren't separate from this vision, they were its physical manifestation. What makes this collapse so revealing is how it mirrors modern urban vulnerabilities. Like Tenochtitlan, our cities rely on invisible systems, subway tunnels, electrical grids, water treatment plants, maintained by specialized tools and the people who wield them. The Chinampas warn us that civilizations aren't defeated just by invaders or disasters, but by the quiet disappearance of the ordinary objects that make complexity possible. Because sometimes the difference between a metropolis and a ruin isn't a conquistador's sword, but a simple wooden scoop that no one thought to protect. For over 60,000 years, the Aboriginal peoples of Australia shaped their continent not with plows or axes, but with fire. The practice known as fire stick farming wasn't just about burning land. It was a precise ecological art, conducted with tools as simple as they were sacred. Fire sticks made from particular types of smoldering bark, carrying dishes to transport flames, and specially notched digging sticks to control the edges of burns. These were the instruments of a living partnership between humans and landscape. When British colonists banned these practices in the 18th and 19th centuries, they didn't just outlaw tools, they disrupted an ancient equilibrium that had sustained both people and ecosystems for millennia. The genius of Aboriginal fire management lay in its specificity. Different plant communities required distinct burning techniques: low, cool fires to encourage grass growth for kangaroos in some areas, hotter burns to clear underbrush in others. The tools made this precision possible. Fire sticks crafted from stringy bark could smolder for hours, allowing elders to walk country and ignite patches exactly when conditions were right. Digging sticks not only carried cultural knowledge through their carved patterns, but served as practical instruments to scrape fire breaks or turn burning logs. Every tool was multi-purpose, every technique embedded with layers of ecological understanding, passed down through generations in songlines and ceremony. Colonial authorities saw only danger in these practices. By confiscating fire sticks and outlawing controlled burns, they triggered ecological chaos. Without regular low-intensity fires, fuel loads built up to catastrophic levels. The dense undergrowth that resulted choked out traditional food plants and created conditions for devastating wildfires, the very disasters Aboriginal burning had once prevented. Kangaroo populations crashed as grasslands turned to scrub. Even the soil changed as the absence of ash fertilization altered nutrient cycles. The land became unrecognizable, not just to its original stewards, but to itself. But the deepest loss was cultural. Fire sticks weren't merely practical objects, they were sacred texts in physical form. Their preparation involved rituals that connected users to ancestral beings who had first brought fire to humanity. Certain trees could only be harvested by particular kinship groups at specific times of year. The act of carrying fire across country was a form of storytelling, with routes retracing the journeys of creator ancestors. When these practices were suppressed, it wasn't just land management that suffered. The very fabric of Aboriginal law and identity began to fray, as generations grew up disconnected from the tools that had once woven knowledge, land, and people together. Modern ecologists studying Australia's worsening bushfire crises have come to a humbling realization. Aboriginal fire stick farming wasn't primitive, it was peerless ecological engineering. In Arnhem Land, where traditional burning has been reintroduced, biodiversity flourishes in ways that astonish scientists. Mosaic burn patterns create habitat edges that support more species than uniform wilderness. Certain plants only germinate after the precise heat levels produced by Aboriginal burning techniques. It's a powerful reminder that the most sophisticated tools aren't always the most complex sometimes. They're the ones that listen closest to the land. The story of firestick farming forces us to reconsider what progress really means, because sometimes the most advanced technology isn't a gleaming machine, but a smoldering stick held in wise hands that understand how small flames can sustain vast worlds. In the heart of medieval Europe, the rhythmic rumble of millstones wasn't just background noise, it was the sound of civilization itself turning. These massive stone discs, some weighing over a ton, were the unsung heroes of every village, grinding grain into flour that fed entire communities. But here's what most history books miss. These weren't just tools, they were shared infrastructure as vital as roads or bridges. And their sudden disappearance in the 16th century didn't just cause inconvenience, it rewired the social contract of daily life. Picture a typical village mill. The millstone wasn't something any one family could own or replace. Quarried from specific types of French or German sandstone, shaped by master masons and maintained by collective labor, these stones were the physical embodiment of communal trust. Villagers paid fees to the lord or monastery for access, but the true cost was in upkeep: teams of oxen to turn the stones, apprentices to monitor the grind, carpenters to maintain the wooden gears. This system worked flawlessly until it didn't. As wars ravaged the continent and trade routes fractured, replacement stones became impossible to source. A single cracked millstone could plunge hundreds into hunger overnight. The crisis peaked during the Little Ice Age of the 1560s, when freak frost shattered already weakened stones. Without them, peasants resorted to hand-querns, small, inefficient grinding tools that took hours to produce inferior flour. Bread, the staple of every meal, became dense, gritty, and scarce. But the real catastrophe was social. Mills had been gathering places where news spread, marriages were brokered, and disputes settled. Their decline didn't just mean longer bread lines, it meant the unraveling of village cohesion. In England's Midland Revolt of 1607, rioters didn't just target tax collectors, they smashed millers' houses, a visceral reaction to the breakdown of the most basic communal trust, the promise of daily bread. Archaeologists studying abandoned mills find haunting evidence of improvisation. Some villages attempted repairs with mismatched stone halves, their uneven surfaces leaving telltale gouges in surviving flour barrels. Others repurposed broken fragments as cobblestones, literally paving over their hunger. The deeper lesson here isn't about technology, it's about interdependence. That millstone's smooth surface represented centuries of collective problem-solving, from the quarrymen who knew which sandstone resisted erosion to the masons who carved grooves at precise angles for optimal grinding. Its loss wasn't just mechanical, it was the erosion of 1,000 tiny acts of cooperation that had made society possible. What makes this collapse so unsettlingly modern is how it mirrors our own fragile systems. Like medieval villagers, we rarely think about the shared mechanisms that keep our pantries full until the day the wheels stop turning. The millstone's story whispers a warning across the centuries. Civilizations aren't undone by the loss of flashy technologies, but by the quiet disappearance of ordinary objects that silently weave people together in acts of mutual survival. Because hunger doesn't just start in empty fields sometimes, it begins with a single crack in a stone no one thought to protect. High in the thin air of the Himalayas, where oxygen is scarce and paths cling to sheer cliffs, survival once depended on a simple wooden frame, the car, the salt caravan's carrying basket. These weren't just containers, they were the lifelines connecting isolated valleys to the outside world. Crafted from resilient juniper wood and reinforced with yak leather straps, each car was a masterpiece of communal engineering, adjusted over generations to balance 60-pound salt blocks along treacherous passes. When these tools began vanishing in the 20th century, it wasn't just a trade route that collapsed, it was an ancient web of interdependence that had sustained mountain cultures for millennia. The salt caravans of Tibet and Nepal operated like clockwork, their rhythms dictated by tools honed for extreme conditions. Specialized ice axes carved steps into glaciers for yaks to pass. Leather-wrapped wooden pulleys lowered baskets across crevices. Even the yaks' copper bells were precisely tuned, their tones carried farther in thin air, allowing stragglers to rejoin the caravan in whiteout conditions. Every tool served multiple purposes. The same pole that tested snow depth could become a splint for broken bones, while the salt baskets doubled as makeshift rafts across meltwater rivers. This wasn't just equipment, it was a mobile survival system perfected through countless journeys. When Chinese annexation disrupted Tibetan salt lakes in the 1950s and modern roads bypassed traditional trails, the caravan tools lost their purpose. At first, the changes seemed small, a missing pulley here, an unrepaired basket there, but the domino effect was catastrophic. Villages that had bartered salt for grain suddenly found themselves cut off. Without the caravan's seasonal passage, blacksmiths who once maintained tools lost their livelihoods. The intricate knowledge of glacier crossings, where to step, when to rest, faded with no apprentices to teach. Even spiritual practices unraveled, as prayer flags that once lined the routes now frayed unattended. The most profound loss was cultural connectivity. Salt caravans had been more than supply chains, they were information networks. A dented car might carry news of a marriage in one valley to relatives 3 passes away. The specific knot patterns on yak halters signaled which villages had contributed to the shared endeavor. Without these moving archives, mountain communities didn't just become poorer, they became strangers to each other. Linguists studying Himalayan dialects have found startling divergences in languages that were once unified by caravan contact, as if the very words had crystallized in isolation. Today, as climate change melts glaciers and ancient trails crumble, the last car baskets sit in museums, but their lesson echoes globally. In our hyper-connected world, we forget how much civilization relies on humble objects that knit places together. The Himalayan salt tools didn't just move goods, they carried trust, tradition, and the quiet understanding that no community, no matter how remote, survives alone. And perhaps that's the most haunting insight of all, that sometimes the ties that bind us aren't grand treaties or digital networks, but the worn wooden implements that remind us we're all part of the same precarious journey. Along the sun-baked coast of East Africa, the Swahili city-states built empires not of conquest but of coral. From Mogadishu to Kilwa, towering stone mosques and palaces rose from the shoreline, their intricate lattices and vaulted arches carved from living reefs. But these architectural marvels weren't shaped by individual genius, they were communal artworks, crafted with shared tools whose disappearance would silence an entire building tradition. The coral rasps, toothed chisels, and lime mixing troughs stored in neighborhood workshops weren't just instruments, they were the physical library of Swahili coastal identity. And when these tools vanished in the 18th century, the loss wasn't merely structural, it severed a 1,000-year conversation between land and sea. The magic of Swahili architecture lay in its symbiotic relationship with the ocean. Coral blocks were cut underwater during low tide using serrated iron saws, tools passed down through guilds of masons who knew exactly when the lunar cycle made the reefs most workable. These weren't crude implements. Their teeth were spaced to match the porosity of specific coral species, preventing cracks during carving. Lime mortar, the glue holding everything together, was mixed in communal troughs using a precise ratio of burned seashells and sand, a recipe guarded like state secrets. Every tool embodied generations of trial and error, the curve of a chisel's handle designed to fit the grip needed for delicate Quranic inscriptions, the weight of a hammer balanced for knocking loose blocks without shattering them. Then the unraveling began, as Omani and Portuguese invasions disrupted trade routes in the 1700s. The specialized iron for coral saws became impossible to source. Replacement tools, when they could be found, were often the wrong alloy, too brittle for tidal pressures or prone to rust in salt air. Slowly, the great coral quarries fell silent. Buildings that once took months to erect now took years, then decades, then never. The consequences rippled through every aspect of coastal life. Without the constant demand for skilled masons, apprenticeship systems collapsed. The intricate coral carvings that had served as architectural records, detailing everything from monsoon patterns to genealogies, became indecipherable to later generations. Even Swahili poetry suffered, its metaphors drawn from coral construction losing their resonance when audiences had never seen a master craftsman at work. But the deepest loss was spiritual. Coral buildings weren't just functional, they were cosmological mirrors. The mihrab's orientation toward Mecca was calibrated using tide measuring tools. Prayer niches incorporated coral species that bloomed during Ramadan. When these traditions faded, the connection between worship and environment weakened. Mosques rebuilt with imported bricks lacked the acoustic properties of porous coral, altering the very sound of devotion. The ocean, once a partner in sacred architecture, became merely a view. Modern conservators working on UNESCO-funded restorations face a haunting challenge. They can analyze the chemical composition of ancient mortar or 3D scan crumbling facades, but the living knowledge behind those tools is gone. A chisel's angle might be replicated, but not the lifetime of muscle memory that guided its strokes. It's a poignant reminder that cultural heritage isn't just about preserving objects, it's about safeguarding the ordinary implements that turn skill into legacy. Because sometimes extinction isn't marked by the fall of a great wall, but by the quiet rusting of a forgotten saw and the stories it will never carve again. The Inca Empire stretched over 2,000 miles along the Andes, from modern-day Colombia to Chile, a territory so vast it would take months to traverse on foot. Yet messengers could relay news from Quito to Cuzco in less than a week, thanks to the most sophisticated road system the ancient Americas had ever seen. These weren't just dirt paths, but engineering marvels, suspension bridges woven from mountain grasses, stone-paved highways clinging to cliff faces, and staircases cut into living rock. But the true secret of this network wasn't the shimmering torques and intricate brooches of the Celts weren't just decorations. They were a language. Every twist of gold, every enamel inlay spoke of status, belief, and connection. But what truly brought these masterpieces to life wasn't just the skill of individual artisans. It was the communal forging tools stored in sacred workshops across Iron Age Europe, tools so specialized they carried the fingerprints of generations. When these began vanishing during the Roman conquests, the Celts didn't just lose their jewelry. They lost the very mechanism that had turned metal into meaning for centuries. Take the ceremonial anvils of Gaul, for instance. These weren't mere work surfaces but consecrated objects passed down through guilds of smith priests. Their unique shapes, slightly concave for hammering torques, grooved for wire drawing encoded centuries of technical and spiritual knowledge. A single anvil might be used by an entire region's craftsmen, its surface worn smooth by countless hands. But as Roman legions dismantled Celtic sanctuaries in the 1st century BCE, these sacred workshops were looted or destroyed. Without them, the precise techniques for creating the iconic Latin swirls, those hypnotic, flowing patterns that adorned everything from swords to horse harnesses, began fading. The loss wasn't just aesthetic, it was existential. For the Celts, metalwork wasn't separate from identity. It was how tribes recognized each other across vast distances, how alliances were sealed through gifted arm rings, how the otherworld was made tangible through ritual cauldrons. The economic fallout was equally devastating. Celtic metalworkers had operated within an intricate trade network stretching from Ireland to Anatolia. Raw tin from Cornwall, gold from Transylvania, and amber from the Baltic all flowed along routes maintained by the constant demand for forged goods. When shared tools disappeared, so did the uniformity that made these trades possible. A brooch made in Bohemia might no longer fit the cloak pins of Gaul, disrupting centuries of compatible design. Soon, whole trade hubs like the oppidum of Manching, once a bustling center of metallurgy, dwindled into obscurity. But the deepest wound was to cultural memory. Celtic smithing tools weren't just functional, they were mnemonic devices. The curve of a hammer's handle might dictate the sweep of a spiral pattern, preserving ancestral styles through muscle memory rather than written manuals. Without these physical guides, later attempts to recreate Celtic art often missed the hidden symmetries and sacred ratios that had once made the pieces vibrate with life. Archaeologists can spot the decline in surviving artifacts, the way later Celtic-style jewelry lacks the dynamic balance of earlier works, as if the very soul had leaked out of the metal. What makes this collapse so poignant is how it redefines artistry. We think of creativity as an individual spark, but the Celts remind us it's often a collective flame, kept alive by shared tools and communal spaces. Their story whispers a warning across the millennia. When the ordinary objects that bind craft to culture vanish, what's lost isn't just beauty, it's the silent language that tells a people who they are. And perhaps that's the most fragile treasure of all. The Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia wasn't just the cradle of civilization, it was a miracle of human ingenuity, turning desert into wheat fields through an intricate web of canals and ditches. But the real heroes of this transformation weren't the ziggurats or the first written laws. They were the humble tools stored in every village along the Tigris and Euphrates, copper-tipped shovels for dredging canals, wooden sluice gates calibrated to the millimeter, and woven reed baskets for carrying silt to reinforce embankments. These weren't just farming implements, they were the life support system for the world's first cities. And when these tools began disappearing around 2200 BCE, the consequences weren't just local. They unraveled an entire model of urban living that had thrived for 1,000 years. The genius of Sumerian irrigation lay in its precision. Unlike modern systems, these canals required constant communal maintenance. A single season of neglect could choke them with silt. Specialized tools made this possible. Curved bronze hose scraped algae without damaging clay linings. Grading rods marked with cuneiform measurements ensured consistent water depth across fields. Even the baskets used to transport mud were engineered. They're weaved tight enough to hold sediment but loose enough to let excess water drain. Every tool was a masterpiece of adaptation, refined over generations to suit the region's unique mix of fertile soil and scorching sun. Then the cracks appeared. As political unrest disrupted trade routes, the copper needed to repair shovels and sluice fittings grew scarce. Without these tools, canals silted up unevenly, creating stagnant pools where evaporation left behind toxic salt deposits. Slowly, inexorably, the breadbasket of Sumer began poisoning itself. Wheat yields plummeted as salt crystals choked roots. Farmers switched to more salt-tolerant barley, but even this was a stopgap. Tablets from the period record harvests dropping from 30 grains reaped for every one sown to barely 2. The very tools that had tamed the rivers now couldn't save the land from their absence, but the true collapse was social. Irrigation had been the glue holding Sumerian city-states together. The labor required to maintain canals fostered cooperation between neighborhoods and generations. Annual dredging festivals doubled as civic rituals, where disputes were settled and marriages arranged. As these practices faded, so did the collective identity they sustained. Archaeologists find haunting evidence in abandoned cities like and Lagash canals filled with debris. Their carefully engineered slopes collapsed into chaos. The most poignant finds are the broken sluice gates, some repaired with makeshift clay patches that held just long enough for one more harvest before giving way. What makes Sumer's downfall so revealing is how it mirrors modern climate challenges. Their irrigation tools weren't just technology, they were climate adaptation incarnate, a 1,000-year conversation between humans and a fragile environment. When those tools vanished, it wasn't just infrastructure that failed, but the accumulated wisdom of how to thrive in a land that could turn hostile overnight. It's a lesson etched in cuneiform and crumbling clay. Civilization isn't just about building marvels, but about maintaining the ordinary objects that keep them, and us from slipping back into the dust. The Mongol Empire's conquest stretched from the Pacific to the Mediterranean, not just because of their famed archers, but because of their saddles. These weren't ordinary riding seats, they were masterpieces of communal craftsmanship, assembled with tools so specialized they functioned like a nomadic assembly line. The curved knives for shaping willow frames, the bone needles for stitching felt padding, even the lacquer pots for waterproofing leather straps, these were the unsung weapons that turned steppe riders into history's most formidable cavalry. When these shared tools began disappearing in the 14th century, Genghis Khan's descendants didn't just lose a way to ride, they lost the very mechanism that had turned horsemen into empire builders. At its peak, Mongolian saddle production was a mobile industry. Blacksmith families traveled with the armies, their anvils strapped to camels, ready to set up workshops wherever grass grew. Each tool in their kit served a precise purpose: grooved mallets for bending wood without splitting it, awls calibrated to pierce exactly 4 layers of wet leather for optimal stitching strength. The saddles they produced were engineering marvels, high-cantled for stability during archery, lightweight enough for horses to gallop all day, yet sturdy enough to last generations. But their true power lay in standardization. A warrior could dismount from his exhausted steed near Samarkand and find an identical replacement saddle waiting in a captured Persian stable because the tools that made them were shared across the empire. The decline started with fragmentation. As the Khanates fractured, the once unified network of saddle workshops dissolved. Specialized tools wore out and couldn't be replaced. The iron for curved knives now went to local warlords rather than imperial artisans. Without standardized saddles, the Mongols' tactical advantage evaporated. Their signature maneuver, the feigned retreat, where riders wheeled seamlessly in unison, became chaotic as improvised saddles shifted under riders' weight. Sieges dragged on without the mobile forges that once produced fresh saddles on demand. Even the famed postal system, the Yam, slowed as relay stations lacked the tools to maintain couriers' gear. What's often overlooked is how this eroded the Mongols' governance model. Their administration relied on officials constantly riding between provinces, a system possible only with reliable saddles. When envoys began arriving late or injured from poorly fitted equipment, tax collection faltered and rebellions festered unchecked. The great silver plaques that once proclaimed Mongol authority now gathered dust in regional offices, their decrees unenforced because the men meant to carry them could no longer ride comfortably for weeks on end. Modern military historians see haunting parallels in this collapse. The Mongols didn't lose their empire to superior technology or larger armies. They lost it to the slow erosion of the humble tools that made their mobility possible. It's a lesson that echoes through time. Geopolitical power isn't just about weapons or wealth, but about maintaining the ordinary objects that let societies move, literally and figuratively, with purpose. Because sometimes the mightiest empires aren't toppled by invasion or revolt, but by something as simple as a missing all that no one thought to replace. The rhythmic clatter of handlooms had been the soundtrack of English villages for centuries, a communal symphony where every clack of the shuttle and press of the treadle wove together more than just cloth. These weren't just tools, they were the anchors of rural life passed down through families like heirlooms, their wooden frames worn smooth by generations of hands. But in the early 1800s, that rhythm was shattered by the deafening roar of mechanized looms. What followed wasn't just technological change, it was a firestorm of rebellion that exposed the hidden bonds between tools, dignity, and survival. The Luddite uprisings weren't mindless vandalism, as history often paints them. They were desperate acts of preservation. For skilled weavers, the loom wasn't just a machine, it was a physical extension of their identity. The precise tension of the warp threads, the subtle flick of the wrist that created intricate patterns, these skills took lifetimes to master. Factory looms operated by unskilled laborers reduced centuries of artistry to mindless repetition. But the real betrayal was social. Traditional weaving had been a communal affair, neighbors gathering in cottages to share tools, compare techniques, and barter finished cloth for goods. The new factories didn't just replace looms, they erased the entire ecosystem of mutual aid that had sustained villages. When masked Luddites began smashing mechanized looms in midnight raids, they weren't just attacking machines, they were defending a way of life. Their hammers found their marks with chilling precision, targeting only the factory equipment while leaving handlooms untouched. Some even pinned notes to the wreckage signed by the mythical King Lud, a nod to the folkloric figure who protected craftsmen's rights. The British government responded with brutal force, deploying more troops to suppress the weavers than were fighting Napoleon in Spain. At the York trials of 1813, over a dozen men were hanged for machine breaking, their executions meant to terrify others into submission. Yet the most devastating loss wasn't the gallows or the shattered looms, it was the unraveling of community itself. Without shared weaving tools, villages lost their economic glue. Families that once pooled resources to maintain looms now competed for factory wages. Traditional patterns, once guarded like family recipes, faded as mass production standardized designs. Even the seasonal rhythms of weaving, winter for spinning, spring for dyeing, summer for selling, collapsed under the factory's ceaseless monotony. Modern economists often dismiss the Luddites as backwards looking, but their rebellion holds a mirror to our own age of automation. Because tools aren't just about function, they're about belonging. When we lose the instruments that connect us, whether it's a weaver's loom or a neighborhood workshop, we don't just surrender efficiency. We risk losing the quiet, daily acts of cooperation that remind us we're part of something larger than ourselves. The Luddites didn't fear progress. They feared the silence left behind when the clatter of shared labor stops, and with it, the heartbeat of community. From the silent collapse of Anasazi irrigation to the violent upheaval of Luddite revolts, These 23 historical breakdowns trace a pattern more profound than simple technological loss. They reveal civilizations unraveling at the seams when the tools binding them together, whether bronze sickles or coral chisels, slipped quietly from collective grasp. This isn't just a story about objects disappearing. It's about the invisible networks of trust, ritual, and mutual dependence that evaporate with them. The Mayan stonemasons' adze wasn't merely a carving tool, it was the physical manifestation of a shared language. The Inuit snow knife didn't just shape ice blocks, it sculpted the rhythms of communal survival. Our modern world, for all its complexity, still dances on this same fragile edge. Consider how quickly the pandemic exposed our reliance on undervalued systems, the shipping containers piling up at ports, the semiconductor shortages idling car factories. These aren't just supply chain hiccups, they're contemporary versions of the Bronze Age tin crisis or the Ming Dynasty's printing collapse. The difference is scale, not substance. Today's communal tools might be digital open-source software, undersea internet cables, even standardized shipping pallets, but their sudden absence could paralyze civilization just as thoroughly as a missing millstone starved medieval villages. Yet history offers more than warnings, it provides blueprints for resilience. The Polynesian Voyaging canoes revival shows how cultural memory can be reclaimed. Modern cities experimenting with communal tool libraries and repair cafes echo the shared workshops of Tenochtitlan or medieval guild halls. Protecting these systems starts with recognition, seeing the humble objects around us not as disposable conveniences, but as the connective tissue of society. So here's the challenge these stories leave us with. What are our snow knives and sickles, which uncelebrated tools, if vanished tomorrow, would send shockwaves through our daily lives? The answers might surprise you: a standardized container seal, a cryptographic algorithm, even the humble smartphone charger. Because the great irony of civilization is this: our grandest achievements often depend on the smallest, most overlooked things we share. And when we forget that, history whispers the consequences through 23 cautionary tales, each more urgent than the last.